The black community in the United States knows all too well that if you not learn from your history, you will be doomed to repeat it. Unfortunately for black Americans, our history includes an unbroken line of racist policy and structural violence. From enslavement to medical experimentation, from public lynchings to police brutality, it's not only not an exaggeration, but probably an understatement to proclaim that black Americans had to fight for every inch that we've gained in this country. There's a long and devastating history of white people in power wielding that power to either eliminate or weaken black education through anti-literacy laws, and that's the subject of today's video. In 1829, Georgia made it illegal to teach black people to read, punishable by fine or imprisonment. In 1830, Louisiana and North Carolina passed laws punishing anyone teaching black people to learn to read or write. By 1832, Alabama and Virginia prohibited whites from teaching black people to read, also punishable by fines and whippings. 1833, Georgia made it illegal for black people to work in jobs that required literacy. In 1847, Missouri prohibits teaching black people, free or enslaved, to read or write, and prohibited black people from assembling to worship. Let's zoom in on this 1847 policy because schools in the United States don't really teach a comprehensive slate of black history. Many people assume that there were always laws outlawing black education. And this theory promotes many black anti-intellectual myths. The laws banning black people from learning to read and write were in direct response to black people accessing literacy and using that literacy as a means of resistance. In 1847, Missouri passed a law outlawing reading and writing because black people were founding schools and educating black children and adults. One of such schools was founded by a formerly enslaved pastor by the name of John Berry Meacham. The law read, "No person shall keep or teach any school for the instruction of Negroes or mulattoes, people of mixed race, in reading or writing in this state." These anti-literacy laws were about two things, fear and control, and actually had less to do about the literacy of black people and more to do about the illiteracy of non-land owning white citizens who in a slave economy were able to find work on plantations as overseers and slave catchers. One of the fears was that educated free black people would be able to write counterfeit freedom passes that illiterate slave catchers could not read. In this resides a critical lesson about how white supremacy functions. If the goal of white supremacy was to elevate all white people over all people of color, the solution to this problem is simple. Just educate the poor white citizens. But plantation owners had no interest in that either. A core function of white supremacy is pitting poor white citizens against poor black citizens, an effective strategy that is still wielded until this day. So white plantation owners sowed fear that black people learning to read will lead to outright rebellion against white people and white power structures. So education was hoarded and weaponized. John Berry Meacham is not deterred by the passing of this law, and his school is only closed temporarily. John Meacham buys a steamboat and educates black children on the Mississippi River outside of the jurisdiction of the state. Myths about black educational inferiority are not only untrue, but they're also ahistorical. In fact, there's a strong argument to be made that the schools that were established for black children as a result of the advocacy of the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War are the first example of the formation of a public education system in the United States. Unfortunately, the sweeping regression that took place after the Civil War, the passing of grandfather clauses, you can only vote if your grandfather could, poll taxes, and literacy tests, Louisiana's voter rolls went from almost 128,000 black voters in 1888 to just 730 in 1910. Schools for black children lost funding, schools for white children took their place, setting the stage for 40 years later for Ruby Bridges and the Madonna Three to integrate schools in the first city to offer public education for black children. Far too many people know far too little about the centuries of tampering with black children's right to a quality education.
And there was and like we was in school, there was throwing glass at black people and little kids.
What school was this again?
The Roger class.
Are you going back to school tomorrow?
No way.
I'm ordering you to disperse in the name of the Commonwealth. If you're not going to disperse, you're going to be arrested.
In a country in which schools were still being forcibly integrated in the 1970s, 50 years later are more segregated now than they were then. In our workshops, when we talk about the history, participants' mouths gape open as they wonder, how could people be so cruel to enforce such oppressive policies? But if you look at the central themes of anti-literacy policies, the exact same playbook is being used right now as a means to ban AP Black History studies, ban Black history from curriculums, ban any semblance of anti-racism education in schools. So what happens is that we just see the same horror movie playing on repeat. White people in power stoke fears. White people organize and protest against racial progress, from anti-literacy laws to anti-integration policy to anti-racism, and the book bans in schools. It's all the continuation of the same thread, and is why progress in this country is so hard to come by, because this playbook is so effective. In less than 2 years, 28 states have passed modern-day anti-literacy laws. It is also instructive on how white supremacy hurts all of us, in the frequent checkpoints we are given in history to course correct and do something different. Instead of 1847 being marked by white citizens who themselves did not have access to a formal education system, advocating against Black education, it could have been marked by them joining with free Blacks to fight for an education system for all. Instead of the decades following the Brown versus Board of Education decision being marked by protests from white parents against integration, the founding of private schools to keep their children out of schools with Black children, and the suing of governments over integration policies, these parents could have fought for integrated schooling years prior, which the data says is best for all children. In 1958, the governor of Arkansas literally closed all schools in Little Rock to oppose integration because it was a popular policy decision amongst his constituents. Imagine the brainwashing power of white supremacy, that you would rather there be no schools than schools that were integrated, or that you would rather schools have less books rather than more books. Few examples to illustrate as well as this how white supremacy makes all of us sick in the end. For the people who look to the past and wonder how the people could have supported such oppressive policies, you need not look any further than what is happening in our country right now.
How do you think things are going to work out here at Roxbury High?
I guess it'll work out all right. If the parents just stay out of it all and let the kids work it out for themselves, it'll be all right.